Bad Ideas, the show where we look at misfires, mistakes, and miscalculations from all throughout history.
I'm Tony Southcott.
And I'm Albert Berg, and Tony has our bad idea for us this week. Tony, what is your bad idea?
Today we're going to be talking about the People's Temple, Jim Jones, and Jonestown. I'm going to warn you guys right up front, this is going to be a darker episode than some of the other things we've put out recently. So, you've been warned. The People's Temple and Jim Jones have entered into a sort of infamy that's rare at any point in history. Don't drink the Kool-Aid has become a widely known expression because of the events in Guyana, but few people know the story that led to the suicide of over 900 people.
Is it appropriate for me to interject here and say it's questionable whether we should even call it a suicide?
Yeah, that's something that a lot of people have asked. They kind of call it a sort of murder-suicide. Interesting in the language.
Many of the people weren't cool about it once it was happening. So,
yeah, because there were a lot of people that were not cool about it, and that's something we're going to be getting into a little bit later. We're also going to be running through a lot of information very quickly, especially because
I'll try to interrupt you as often as possible.
Definitely. But I'm trying to give a little bit of the context behind why people would join this church, because whenever you look at it from the outside, it's like, oh, how could you convince so many people to do this? But you have to see what Jim Jones was doing back before he kind of lost his mind.
All right. Well, tell us about that.
What most people don't know is that the movement started in an innocent enough way, that Jim Jones was a man who not only preached racial equality in the 50s and 60s, but did massive amounts of work to bring that about. In 1956, the outspoken Jones began his church. He wasn't afraid to call himself a socialist in America drenched in McCarthyism. He actually lived up to the socialist title as well. His church was entirely based around social change, feeding the hungry, clothing the poor, and integrating a very racially segregated Indianapolis. He was able to do this at first by sheer will. He would ask his congregation about their needs, about what was causing them pain. It could be something small like a bill they couldn't pay, where the church would band together to cover it, or being mistreated by local government and employers. At the time, housing and schools were very much segregated. Black people were relegated to ghettos that were poorly maintained and rarely able to break out of them. Jones found his way into planning commissions, city meetings, and more. He was extremely effective at infiltrating these institutions and began making them change policy in ways that would help the African American communities in Indianapolis.
Man, I did not know that this guy started out as kind of someone who had some good ideas.
Yeah, like that's what blew me away whenever I was reading some books about it, and it's just, he started out doing so many things that were effective and powerful. Like, he started peaceful protests outside of restaurants that weren't integrated. Dozens of restaurants in Indianapolis would open their door to people of all races because of the People's Temple. Since the temple would actively encourage its members to attend these restaurants and often even pay the bills for their members to do so, these restaurants began to thrive from the new income and outpace their competitors. Many restaurants after this point decided to desegregate based on the example and feared that the People's Temple would come after them. So it started to become kind of a preventative thing where they just opened as desegregated. The People's Temple also had a very effective drug recovery program in which many who passed through to end up being on scholarships from the church, they would full on take somebody who was addicted to heroin or other drugs, rehabilitate them in their own rehab houses, and send them to school. It was like they were forced to basically stay in sort of a halfway house type thing where if they dropped below a B, they could lose their scholarship and everything, but they were very attended to, and they did a lot to make sure that these people had resources to get them through this. They also started a ton of free nursing homes because, especially in black communities, the nursing homes were subpar. So using their influence and their money, they opened up many nursing homes that were staffed by volunteers, and the inspectors and people of Indianapolis actually were very, very pleased with the condition, the cleanliness, and the care that the people were receiving in these nursing homes.
I have a question about this. I did not realize that Jim Jones was this active in sort of the racial equality movement. And in my mind, Jonestown was a primarily white
Very
catastrophe.
much not the case.
Were there other black and white parishioners there who were affected at the same time?
Whenever he started out in 56, I think it was about 20% black, and it ended up being about 50-50. By the time like Jonestown was moving, I think he actually had more people of other races than whites at Jonestown. So it was a pretty broad thing. He also spoke like a black minister, where it was a lot of very kind of excited, fiery, like up and just like giving long sermons and not really having the structure that you would get from like a Lutheran church or Methodist or anything like that. So he kind of spoke in that same way as the other black preachers of his age.
Well, there's also the cadence, Tony, of
it's
the
definitely
black
the cadence.
preacher.
Yes,
and I feel like I'm going to get some flack on Twitter for appropriating their way of speaking.
It's just an example. While all this was happening, Jim Jones began to travel in evangelical circles. At these revivals, he would commit healings. Almost all of the healings he claimed to commit were plants in the audience. Someone would be weeping about terminal cancer, and Jones would bring them to the stage, and using his powers, he would rip the cancer out of them and hold it high. Most often, they used rotten chicken guts and sleight of hand to cure these cancers.
Okay, well, now we're getting into some bad stuff. I was about ready to apply for this guy's sainthood.
And this is the type of stuff where it just started going a little bit sideways. And he claimed to be psychic as well. Like, he would have people, these plants that were in the audience, they would go, and before the sermon would start, they would talk to everybody, learn about their problems, learn about their concerns, and then slip notes to him, like, under the pulpit and everything. So that in the middle, he would call out some person he'd never met before, call them out by name, and talk about their afflictions. Basically, using his wife and various other parishioners, he was able to get this sort of inside information and astonish many crowds, made them feel like they were witnessing something surreal and powerful.
This is making me nervous. Now, I know how this story ends, but the fact that this is so calculated on this guy's part is what's scary. In your research, is this a man who believes that he has these powers and is just sort of using the sleight of hand to kind of boost the belief in him, or is he 100% a huckster?
I think as far as his powers go, he knows that he's a huckster, but he believed that he had a pragmatic belief that if he wanted to encourage socialism in the world, he had to basically get his base up by performing these miracles and getting people under him. Because there was a lot of interesting things where he actually would rail against the teachings of the Bible and everything, but that's coming a little bit later too.
Okay.
Like I said, he had kind of a pragmatic thing. A lot of his relatives, some of his sons and everything, helped out with a lot of these plans because they believed that getting people into the church was the number one thing that they needed to do. More than anything else, he needed to get those people in so that they could effectively cause change. There were a lot of people who actually joined his church, not because they believed in him as a preacher or even the religion that he was preaching, but because they believed in his message and the actions he was taking to affect change in the country. Jones also became close with Reverend Major Jealous Divine, a black minister who claimed to be God and ran an extreme congregation. Since most of their beliefs lined up perfectly and Father Divine was in failing health, Jones sought to inherit the ministry that he was in charge of. This is part of where he started changing his own preaching, because Jones started talking about himself as though he were a living God. Like, he saw how effective it was for Father Divine, and he started sort of affecting those things. And there are some blurred lines here in the fact that, like, does he actually believe it? Is he that much of a narcissist? Or is this just his form of control? But it's really hard to tell at this particular stage.
Since he's not still around to ask.
Yeah.
It is interesting to me the fact that he's willing to be under, or at least allied with, another person who claims to be God, and he comes from a Christian church which generally only believes in the one God, but then he's going to put it out there as either he has to say, I'm a different God, or he has to say, well, that guy, he was wrong about being God. It was actually me all the time.
And that's actually something that he started railing against. Like, he would preach against the Bible and preach against the biblical God. He would say, like, this God is just like, he doesn't care about us. You need an active God like me who's actually going to affect change and going to do this. And, like, he would just start going off about, like, how he didn't believe in that God. And then minutes later, he would be quoting scripture and talking about, like, the loving God and all this other stuff. He was a man that just didn't quite have the thread of his own conversation at times.
It sounds like he was intensely opportunistic, too. Essentially saying whatever he thought would get him where he wanted to go the fastest.
Yes. And he started preaching on reincarnation and how in the past he had been the Buddha, that he had probably been Christ, that his closest friends were the souls of the apostles, like all these other things. And that really didn't quite fit into the whole Christian dogma, but people just decided to go with it anyway. At the same time, he started preaching about the evils of the United States and prophesied that the world was going to end in nuclear fire. He even went so far as to declare exact dates when these things were supposed to happen, But when they didn't, he said that morning he'd had a dream that because of their interference, he was able to stop the nuclear war from happening.
Oh, well, we got that to thank him for.
Yeah, it was very good. But he also started looking at places that were a lot less likely to be nuked. So he looked towards California, like Northern California, a place called Ukiah. And he started to move the temple congregation there because he wanted to create a sort of socialist commune out in the farmland over there. And so he took a very, very large chunk of his congregation, moved them across the entire country, and found themselves in this city in California.
Now, where does he start at?
Indianapolis.
Okay.
So
I don't know a lot about geography, but it seems like moving closer to Russia isn't the best strategy for avoiding nukes, but maybe it was way outside the cities that might have been hit.
It was a few hours outside of San Francisco, so like maybe, but he believed that there would be, like, one of the things he used to preach about is that he had found caves in the mountains near Ukiah that would keep them safe whenever the bombs actually did drop, and they had to follow him because he was the only one who knew the location of the caves. He also got a bunch of pictures of caves that weren't nearly big enough to fit his congregation, but those were the things he would show his congregation.
Okay. I don't know why I'm questioning the logic of a madman, Tony. Madman narcissist. Probably not worth actually digging that far into.
Yeah. While they weren't entirely welcome in Ukiah, the church did thrive. They would take their ministries across the country in buses where they would perform miracles and always left the towns they visited cleaner and better than they found them. Jim Jones wanted his people to be a shining example of egalitarianism and make sure that they always left a good impression. On one particular trip to Washington, D.C., the Washington Post gave them massive praise on how kind-hearted they were and community-oriented the church was. So, like, at this point, they're actually starting to get a fair amount of press. It's not just the local Ukiah papers. It's not just stuff going on in Indianapolis. Because of his, not so much because of the faith healings, but because of the acts that his church did, like, they had some pretty good press rolling in.
Yeah, it seems like he could have done okay just sort of as an agitator for social change. There's a lot of people in that kind of realm even today that seem to have a reasonable amount of a voice and political power that could have got him to the place he wanted to go. I don't know why he needed to add in all this magic and healing and stuff.
Yeah, it's really strange because without any of that, he literally affected laws and social change in one of the most conservative parts of the country. Indianapolis, like, didn't have any idea of, like, what segregation was really doing to the minority populations there. So they just didn't see it and they didn't care. And whenever he brought a lot of this stuff to light, he affected that sort of change. Like, even whenever they started making it law that things had to be desegregated, and a lot of it was because of People's Temple at the time. So it's just weird how this transition happened. And while he was in California, this might have been where things really started breaking. It led him to basically seek out a lot of drugs to keep moving, because he was working all the time. He tried to know every single person in the church. He had to approve everything that the church was doing. Every penny spent had to go through him. And he was just a terrible micromanager for everything going on in the church. And to keep up with this schedule, a lot of times he had to resort to amphetamines, as well as other uppers, speed, and all that other stuff that just kept him peppy enough to keep doing his pace. And at night, he started taking huge amounts of downers and tranquilizers just to make sure he could get some sleep. His health started to slip a little bit. He went from being kind of svelte to being kind of like a fat guy that wore just aviator sunglasses all the time to cover his bloodshot eyes.
This still sounds like just a guy who's trying too hard to do a good thing, though.
Yeah, and that's very true in that he very much thought he was doing the right thing here. This is also whenever he started taking on other lovers, because his wife, Marceline, they had one child together, but she was unable to perform her marital duties, as he called them, because she was very, very sickly. She had a lot of back pain and various other things, and they wouldn't be able to have more kids. This led to them kind of adopting a rainbow family. They adopted 3 kids from Korea. They adopted a black child. They adopted a lot of people trying to show their integration. But he also knew that he wasn't getting enough from her, so he took on a lover named Carolyn Layton, who would be a long-term affair. While we're on the subject of affairs and sex, his time in California, and specifically in San Francisco, seems to be when Jim Jones started taking on many more lovers. There were times when he would force all of the women of the church, as well as many of the men, to write letters about their powerful sexual attraction to Jones. Many of them would later act out these urges with Jones as his influence grew.
Okay. See, all up until now, I feel like things have been sort of within the realm of, like, weird church. Okay? Like, okay, you're saying that you're God. I mean, that's not true, but whatever, all right? And maybe you've, like, committing adultery and you can...
Well, he rationalized it to the church as he had, like, because of all the energy he had to expense, he needed some sort of release to keep him able to channel his healing and all this other stuff.
He had to get those... okay. I'm starting to have some problems with this Jim Jones character, Tony. Tell me more.
Eventually, Jones would try to proposition a cop in San Francisco. He tried to proposition him in a bathroom and was arrested for lewd conduct. And this was a fairly severe blow to the idea that he was a pure preacher that was just trying to do social change, especially in the 60s and early 70s.
Yeah, I could see that.
But it didn't affect quite as much as people thought it would, especially because he was able to get the charges eventually thrown out. Money was rolling in from churches all over California, and Jones started to hoard money in out-of-country banks on the suspicion that he might lose their tax-free status for being socialist. As San Francisco and LA churches proved to be much more lucrative than the rural Northern California ones, this started to make Jones consider bigger plans. He wanted to make a socialist utopia somewhere outside the United States. After reading about the areas least likely to be affected by nuclear fallout, as well as places that spoke English, he settled on Guyana on the northern coast of South America. He actually originally wanted to do Brazil, but he wasn't able to have the same success with in Brazil as he was in America. First off, it was mostly a racial population, so he wasn't really going to affect change there. He tried to help the poor, but not being able to speak the language severely hindered him. He was never able to really get established, even though he spent a few months out there trying. So he chose to go into Guyana, which was a socialist republic that had recently been liberated from Britain. So they spoke English, and they decided that that's where they were going to set up.
He has these weird flashes of, like, logic. He applies logic in the weirdest places, and this sort of scouring the map looking for places that won't be hit by nukes is an interesting view into this guy's brain, where he wants to set up utopia, but only if it's going to be safe from the fallout.
Yeah, well, he figured that was inevitable, and I'm sure a lot of people at the time did as well. Like, it's hard for us to look back to the historical lens, like, into the McCarthy era and all that, but it's just have different times.
Duck and cover. I mean, it was essentially an assumption at the time that eventually somebody was going to pull the trigger. I remember reading a lot of science fiction from the era, and there was just endless descriptions of, bombed out wastelands or people trying to avoid being nuked, and that was a huge fear of the time. So I guess it's not that unusual that would have been a fixation of his or anybody's at the time.
Especially if you're trying to recruit people through fear.
That's also true.
At this point, several news articles were starting to come out about the temple and its human rights violations. Discipline in the church was often handed out by force, usually in the form of lashings, public shamings, and more. They also worked to isolate people from their families, ask for every cent they could from people, and send groups after defectors.
Is this still in the U.S., or are we talking about...
This is still in the U.S. Jim Jones was very offended by any singular person trying to defect, and basically he would kind of pull the Scientology thing, where he would send people out to harass them afterwards. Some people went so far as to completely change their names and just disappear. As these articles came out, Jones moved the plans forward and started to move people to Guyana. The Guyanese government accepted these refugees for their own personal gain, putting them in a very inhospitable region near the border of Venezuela. The area was contested at the time, and Guyana knew that putting Americans near the border would be good insurance that they would not be attacked, or it might cause American intervention.
Very smart move on their part.
Yeah, and they also knew that there was going to be a nice little influx of cash coming in. Part of the reason why they were able to get the lease in Guyana is because they promised to spend certain amounts of money every year, and Guyana just was like, we'll take that American money.
Yeah, them dollar bills.
Which is funny for a socialist nation, but hey, everybody's got to pay their bills.
Yes.
Over the next 4 years, Jonestown would be a grueling work camp where every able-bodied church member would be sent. They would be allowed to come if they gave up their entire life savings and signed their children into the custody of the church. When they reached the promised land, they found back-breaking 16-hour days in clearing out the rainforest for a settlement. It wasn't all bad, as many people found the struggle to be fulfilling. They saw that they were building a community in the middle of a harsh environment, and that slowly they were actually really making some progress. They were building decent enough housing. It was very packed because they just had more people coming in than they expected to. but they were still building a pretty nice settlement, and they were making lives for themselves. They were having trouble getting a lot of their crops to grow properly, and they were constantly having to deal with insect-borne diseases. But they found solace in the fact that they were doing this for their leader, Jim Jones, and that it was really coming together.
I was going to say, I can imagine that you would, especially if you're an American, you have these stories of the Pilgrims coming over and struggling against the elements, and a lot of them dying, but eventually they build their city on the hill, right? Their religiously free place where they can be out there doing their thing. And if you've got that mentality and you're already out there anyway, you might as well have the best attitude you can about it.
Yeah, definitely. And getting back was fairly hard. Like, you could sometimes convince Jim Jones to pay for your way back to the United States if you were doing it on official temple business. But it becomes pretty hard to defect whenever you don't have any money and all your possessions belong to the church, and you're stuck in the middle of Guyana. In 1976, it was probably the best year that the church had. Despite some of the negative press, they were able to work their way into a lot of different political circles, even going so far as to meet Jimmy Carter and speak to his wife, in which they had some correspondence. Jimmy Carter's wife actually recommended them to the ministers of Guyana and various other things so that they could actually have some really good references at the time. Even though this was more of just a quick formality because they only met a couple times, you better believe that Jones milked that for all it was worth. But they also had their church programs going as hard as they could, especially in like the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles, which was one of the poorest neighborhoods. It's where like a lot of the riots happened after Rodney King and all that. So they decided to position themselves in the poorest neighborhoods and basically give these people a different type of life, where they were going across the country doing evangelical work and taking a bunch of them to Guyana as well. So 1976 was a big year for them despite all the negative press, and in 1977, all the good publicity the church had gotten was starting to turn. Several exposés by newspapers led to public suspicion of the church, and a huge court case was started in which one of Jim Jones' bastard sons was trying to be pulled back to America by a defecting person. Basically, they wanted their son back, and Jones just was keeping their son in Guyana and not allowing any sort of contact with with the child's mother, and basically trying to keep them there. And as the case started to grow, some of these other defectors started to pull together to try to make sure that that Jim Jones couldn't get away with it. More court cases mounted, and families of the Jonestown citizens started a group called Concerned Relatives. This group would lobby congressmen, lawyers, and defectors to try to expose the People's Temple as a malicious cult, not just a small socialist faction in an innocent church. It was also at this point that Jim Jones started practicing what he called white nights, in which Jones lined up everyone at the temple, claimed that it was their time to go, and would have them drink the flavor aid, and basically practice a ritual suicide. There were times whenever he did this in the earlier days, like in the early 70s, with his most trusted people. He had them drink inside of this planning committee. They all thought they were dying, they were coughing, they were having all these effects, and basically he just, whatever he told them that none of them had drank poison, but they passed the test, he was very excited, and they all thought it was just a true test of faith. So this is whenever he started doing it. And interestingly enough, the reason why he was so enamored with the suicide thing came from two main places. One was the Masada, in which the Jews killed themselves in a defiant act, and the second was that he very, very much admired Adolf Hitler and thought that his suicide was the perfect way to never be caught.
And the guy who is such a proponent of socialism and racial equality, how is he like on the Hitler train, even a little bit?
It was interesting because that was whenever he was a child, and when every other kid was practicing being a U.S. soldier, he was whipping his cousins into goose-stepping and doing all these other things that were emulating the Nazis. And basically, he was just fascinated by how neat and trim and how perfect everything was, how like all their timing was just on, how they had like all this pageantry and everything else, and the orations that Hitler would put on. So it was weird going back to like that aspect of his childhood, that's who he chose to admire rather than Churchill or some of the other people, or even just U.S. soldiers.
I have to say, the setup here, this idea of making the people drink something that seemed like poison and then faking them out, is diabolical, but a little bit brilliant.
Yeah, in the fact that like they don't know if this is going to be a test or if it's the real thing until people start collapsing around them.
Yes.
Yeah, it's definitely effective and insane. At this time, California Congressman Leo Ryan was eventually persuaded to go to Guyana and see what was going on in Jonestown. When he got there, most of what he saw seemed to be above board, if not a little rehearsed. Everyone seemed to have high praise for Jones, and the grounds were very clean. Everyone seemed to be adequately fed, if not a little bit on the skinny side from all the hard work, and Ryan, as well as the news crew that was with him, were impressed by the Jonestown nursery. They expected that all of their medical facilities and everything else to be very rudimentary, but some of the things that they didn't spare any expenses on were the nursery, the medical facilities, and just some of the other things that were very necessary for life in the jungle. Ryan expected whatever he was going to show up, that there would be hundreds and hundreds of people trying to defect. He expected that at least 10% of the 900 people would try to leave, but really it was only about 8 people that directly came to him and 12 people who snuck out in the night that were trying to defect, so around 20 people.
It still seems like a bad number. Of 900 people, if you got like about 20 of them coming to be like, take me with you, please. It's terrible. Like, he makes the calculation, well, this isn't as bad as I thought it was, so carry on, weird guy.
Well, part of the thing that he had to, like, he wouldn't be able to do anything as far as getting people back from the church unless people were being held there against their will or, by his definition, being brainwashed. So he needed something to show that this was actually happening and people couldn't leave. But because Jones was basically trying to be neutral about these people leaving, it didn't end up showing that until a little bit later. There wasn't a problem until some of Jones's people saw People's Temple members pass a note to a cameraman that begged them for help. Like, I think the note basically read, like, "We cannot escape, please help us." And that was whenever Ryan and everybody else started to realize that there was some pretty nefarious stuff happening here. And the reason why this note was dropped is because the cameraman wasn't expecting it, so basically they got this note and just dropped it a couple times, like trying to scramble to pick it up while he's holding the camera, and some people noticed.
And this went bad for the people who were asking to be rescued, I assume.
It went bad for a lot of people. 2 nights later, when the congressman was set to leave on the 17th, a man named Don Sly attacked him with a knife, but missed his throat just barely. The man approached and kind of hesitated before attacking, so Ryan was able to get out of the way, and some of the Jonestown guards were able to pull him off and take him out. Jim Jones, instead of asking if the congressman was okay, just ran up and was like, "Does this change anything? Are we still okay?" He's like, "It changes some things, but it doesn't change everything." He said that he would let that go so long as the man was tried in the Guyana justice system, and basically got up and decided that he was heading out along with a truck full of some of the People's Temple members that were heading back to America. After Ryan left, Jones could be heard saying, "If they take 20 today, they'll take 60 tomorrow." Basically, Jones had been saying that he was having assassination attempts against him almost every few days, that the Guyanese military wanted him dead, that the Americans were sending CIA assassins, but only God was making it so that they couldn't kill him. He'd been railing about this sort of stuff for a long time. Usually when people were out on the work camps, he would just sit there and talk for 5 or 6 hours over the loudspeaker, just over and over and over again, reiterating how this was a temporary thing and that they were going to relocate to the USSR and so many other things. Like, he, at this point, was basically just so drugged out that he had kind of lost a lot of comprehension, but people were so deep into it that they always rationalized ways to get through. That night, when the congressman went to board his plane, a tractor full of Temple members came up and just started laying waste to the people on the runway. They ended up killing Leo Ryan, as well as some of the crew members and even a couple of the Temple members. They had a different idea on how they were going to do this, but they weren't sure it was actually going to work. One of the most loyal people, Larry Layton, was convinced to pretend to be a defector, and while they were flying away, he was supposed to kill the pilots and crash the plane so it looked like a natural death. But Jones didn't think that the U.S. would actually believe that, so he decided he was just going to go ahead and pull a full-on assassination.
I assume this guy's related to Carol Layton?
Yes. Yeah, he was the former husband of Carolyn Layton and was overjoyed whenever his wife was selected to be basically the mistress of, like, the temple leader.
Yowza.
I'm pretty sure it actually happened again later whenever he was about to marry someone else, and then Jim Jones decided to take her again. So, like, he just basically kept on pulling this guy's girlfriends and wives away. But he was one of the most hardline believers in that. And people were pretty suspicious whenever he said he was going to be one of the defectors. So, like, they knew something was wrong at that point. Jones had been preparing for this for several years, often talking about Masada and how the Jews had decided to commit a revolutionary act of suicide. Jones knew that it was over after the killing was complete and there was no turning back. On the morning of November 18th, 1978, Jones started preaching to his disciples about their final act. He lined up more than 200 children and had their parents or nurses dose them with cyanide-laced flavor aid. He then pressured the most hesitant of the group to drink, sometimes by force. There were a few bodies that had lacerations for when they decided to inject people, instead of just have them drink. The most disturbing thing about this is that you can actually hear this last sermon on recording. Jones always wanted to have a record of the People's Temple's preaching and everything, so there were tons and tons of tapes that you can actually still listen to. And this last one, it stops before Jones is dead, but there are a lot of disturbing things where you can hear people begging for their children's lives. You can hear them trying to reason with them, see if they can make it to Russia, if it's not too late to apologize for things that had happened, because the people didn't know that they had assassinated the congressman. And it's one of the most disturbing things I've ever subjected myself to. I don't recommend it.
I assume we will not have a sample in here in this episode.
I thought about it. We'll see during editing. There were some who feigned death or simply snuck away, but before the morning was out, 909 people lay dead on the grounds of Jonestown. Initially, only a few hundred bodies were reported. This gave the families back in the U.S. hope that some of the people had escaped to the jungle, but the reason for this was they were only identifying bodies on the top layer. They found a full 3 layers of bodies, and in the jungle sun and the time it was taking to get these bodies, the U.S. Army came in and started clearing it out, and they had to put in a special order for snow shovels to handle the remains.
Let that just sink in and all the implications.
The survivors of the People's Temple often recount how amazing Jones had made them feel, his miracles, their gullibility. They all got caught up in the momentum of a shared experience, and they didn't allow themselves to rationally leave earlier. They felt part of something real and ignored the corruption. Few were able to escape the lure of Jones.
You know, the worst part about this story is this guy could have used his evil voodoo or whatever for good, and he did to start with.
Yeah, that was the most heartbreaking thing about this, because I started the book and I expected that there was just going to be weirdness from day one. And there was some weirdness, but this was a man who was very sincere about, like, racial inequity. And he worked so hard to get it at first. He cared about every single person. And I just don't know at what exact point it started to turn. I don't know if it was actually, like, any particular thing, or if it was just a slow decline.
He could have even had the power without going this far.
Yeah. Like, he could have been preaching probably another 20 years and done more to help, like, the civil rights movement than a lot of singular people. Like, if a few things had gone differently, we could have been talking about Jim Jones as a hero, not a full-on mass murderer.
I know, obviously a flawed hero, all right? A guy with, even from the beginning, some relatively obvious flaws, but still someone who just got so full of his own image that he couldn't escape it, and neither could the people around him.
And it's interesting the patterns you see with a lot of major psychopaths, serial killers, and all this, like where they have an abusive and uncaring father along with a very, very overbearing mother, and like he fits that profile exactly. And you can see so much of like him using his charm and everything as a sort of survival technique in the early years and learning how to kind of use that to get what he wanted from people. And it's so strange reading this book that started out with him as like this very charming young child and turning into this. And I recommend people reading up on this just because it's such a fascinating journey, but it is seriously dark, if you couldn't tell from this episode. Like, it's hard to keep reading at moments. And I glossed over so much information. Like, we only have a little bit of time on here to cover some of the things that happen. Like, there's a lot of names, a lot of people, a lot of influences that we couldn't even cover here. And it's just a horrifying journey into the very worst of ideas. Like, as far as all the bad ideas we've covered on here, this following Jim Jones has got to be one of the top ones. It's not the great leap forward, but it's definitely a bad one.
Well, tune in next week for Balloon Fest.
We're going to take a little easier on you guys this coming week. We're going to be talking about Cleveland's Balloon Fest, and we will see you there. If you enjoyed this, please go to our Patreon page at patreon.com/humanechoes and think about supporting the show. Also share this with your friends because it's the number one you can help this podcast thrive, grow, and find more bad ideas to present to you.
We'll see you guys next week. Take care.
Bye.